The morning sun painted the desert landscape in hues of amber and gold, casting long shadows across the weathered wooden fence of Thompson Ranch. I'd grown up hearing stories about this land, stories of my grandfather's resilience, of generations who had carved out a life in this unforgiving but beautiful terrain. Now, at 42, I was the latest caretaker of this legacy. My name is Jack Thompson, and I'm a wildlife photographer. After years of traveling the world, capturing the raw beauty of nature for National Geographic and other publications, I decided to come home. The ranch was more than just property. It was a living, breathing piece of family history. 40 acres of southwest heaven, with rolling hills, ancient cattle pens, and a small but productive well that had sustained my family through decades of drought and hardship. Saguaro Valley Estates was something entirely different from the wild landscape I was used to. When I first moved in, the development looked like a meticulously arranged model community. Identical houses lined perfectly paved streets. Lawns were so uniformly green they looked almost artificial, a stark contrast to the natural, rugged beauty of my ranch that sat just on the edge of the development. The Homeowners Association, or HOA, seemed innocuous at first, a necessary bureaucracy that maintained community standards and managed shared resources. Monthly meetings, some basic rules about exterior maintenance, nothing too intrusive. At least, that's what I thought. My first interaction with the HOA came during the Welcome Committee meeting. A group of retirees and part-time professionals gathered in the community center, a sterile building that looked more like a corporate office than a neighborhood gathering place. That's where I first met Karen Richardson. She wasn't hard to spot. Mid-50s, with perfectly coiffed platinum blonde hair that looked like it had been sculpted by an artist more than styled by a hairdresser. Designer sunglasses perched perpetually on her nose, even indoors. Her crisp white blouse and tailored navy blazer screamed corporate power, despite this being a volunteer position. "Mr. Thompson," she said, extending a hand with perfectly manicured nails, "welcome to Saguaro Valley Estates." Her grip was firm, her smile practiced, the kind of smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. I'd seen similar expressions on corporate executives during my years of international photography assignments. It was a smile that said, "I'm being polite, but don't mistake this for genuine warmth." The welcome packet was a marvel of bureaucratic precision, 37 pages of rules, regulations, and guidelines that seemed to cover every conceivable aspect of property ownership. Font colors for exterior paint, acceptable grass lengths, restrictions on outdoor decorations, vehicle parking regulations, even guidelines for holiday decorations. "We pride ourselves on maintaining a certain standard of living," Karen explained, her voice a perfect blend of honey and steel. "Uniformity ensures property values remain high." I should have seen the warning signs then. The way her gaze lingered on the photographs of my ranch in my portfolio, images of wild landscapes, native plants, the kind of organic beauty that clearly didn't align with her vision of uniformity. My ranch was different. The land bore the marks of generations. Native wildflowers grew where they pleased. The historic cattle pens my grandfather had built stood as silent witnesses to our family's history. Each weathered fence post, each patch of untamed vegetation told a story, something that seemed completely lost on Karen and her HOA. The first warning letter arrived 3 weeks after my move-in. Meticulously typed, printed on heavyweight paper, it cited a violation for unauthorized landscaping. Apparently, the native wildflowers near the fence line didn't meet the HOA's definition of acceptable vegetation. I laughed when I first read it. A ridiculous, bureaucratic nitpick that seemed more like a joke than a serious infraction. If only I had known then what was coming. If only I had understood that for Karen Richardson, this was never about maintaining community standards. This was about control. This was about power. And I was about to become her prime target. The second letter arrived precisely 1 month after the first. Where the initial warning had been almost comical in its pedantry, this one carried a different tone. Heavy bond paper, certified mail, official HOA letterhead with raised gold embossing that seemed to mock the very concept of official communication. $500. That was the fine. Reason: Unauthorized structural modifications and landscape non-compliance. I read the letter twice, then a third time. The cattle pens, the same historic structures that had stood on this land for over 6 decades, were now classified as unauthorized structures requiring immediate removal. The native grasses and wildflowers that had naturally grown on the property were deemed invasive vegetation that violated community landscaping standards. My neighbor, Tom Rodriguez, was the first person I called. A retired civil engineer with a keen eye for bureaucratic nonsense, he'd been battling the HOA for years. "Welcome to the club," Tom said, his laugh bitter. "They tried the same thing with my vegetable garden last year, claimed it was agricultural zoning violation, as if growing tomatoes is some kind of criminal activity." I decided to fight back the only way I knew how, with documentation and reason. The next HOA meeting was my battleground. I arrived with a meticulously prepared folder: historical photographs from the county archives, geological surveys showing the native plant species, documentation proving the cattle pen's historical significance. The community center conference room felt like a tribunal. Fluorescent lights cast a harsh glow on the rows of folding chairs. Board members sat at a long table up front, Karen Richardson in the center like a queen presiding over her domain. She wore a crisp white blazer, her platinum blonde hair perfectly coiffed. Those designer sunglasses remained perched on her nose, despite being indoors. "Mr. Thompson," Karen began, her voice a calculated mixture of condescension and fake politeness, "the board has reviewed your property and found numerous violations of our community standards." I laid out my documentation. "These cattle pens are historical structures," I explained, spreading out black and white photographs. "They were built by my grandfather in 1962. They're part of the ranch's heritage." Karen's perfectly manicured fingers flipped through the documents, her expression unchanging. "Heritage is not a justification for non-compliance. These structures do not meet current safety and aesthetic guidelines." "Safety guidelines?" I challenged. "These pens have stood for over 60 years. They're as solid now as the day they were built." A murmur ran through the room. Most board members looked uncomfortable, all except Karen, who remained stone-faced. "The board has made its decision," she declared. "You have 30 days to remove the structures and modify your landscaping to meet community standards. Failure to do so will result in escalating fines." Tom Rodriguez, sitting in the back of the room, muttered loud enough for several people to hear, "Here we go again." After the meeting, I cornered one of the younger board members, a guy named Mike who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. "This doesn't make sense," I said quietly. "These pens are part of the property's historical record." Mike avoided eye contact. "Look, I don't make the rules," he mumbled. "Karen runs a tight ship." That's when I noticed something odd, a slight tremor in Mike's hand, a nervousness that suggested he knew more than he was letting on. The fine was just the beginning. $500 now, but the letter made it clear this was only the start. Each week of non-compliance would result in additional penalties. By the end of the month, I could be looking at thousands of dollars in fines. My grandfather had fought drought, economic depression, and changing agricultural landscapes. He kept this ranch alive through sheer determination. Now it was my turn to fight, not against nature, but against a bureaucratic machine that seemed determined to strip away everything that made this land unique. I knew one thing for certain: Karen Richardson had no idea what she was starting. The next 2 months were a nightmare of escalating harassment. The fines multiplied like a cancerous growth, each letter more threatening than the last. $500 became $1,000, then $2,000 per week. The HOA found violations in everything. And I mean everything. My irrigation system, which had efficiently watered the property for decades, was suddenly non-compliant. The native grass that had grown naturally on the ranch was declared uncontrolled vegetation that required immediate eradication. They sent multiple inspectors, each finding increasingly ridiculous infractions. One Wednesday morning, I found 3 separate violation notices in my mailbox. One cited the improper placement of my trash cans. They were 3 inches too far from the designated pickup area. Another complained about a small shed that had stood on the property for over 30 years. The third was the most absurd, a warning about unauthorized wildlife habitat created by the natural vegetation. Tom Rodriguez, my neighbor, was experiencing similar persecution. We started meeting regularly, comparing notes and sharing our growing frustration. "They're trying to push us out," Tom explained one evening over coffee. His own battle with the HOA had been ongoing for years. A retired civil engineer with a meticulous nature, he documented every interaction. His crime? A vegetable garden that the HOA claimed violated landscaping standards. Never mind that the garden was beautifully maintained, producing fresh vegetables that he often shared with neighbors. "Look at this," Tom said, spreading out a stack of documents. Violation notices, letters, emails, a paper trail of bureaucratic harassment. They've been systematically targeting properties on the edge of the development, properties with potential. The word potential hung in the air like a loaded gun. My lawyer, Sarah Martinez, was becoming a frequent visitor to the ranch. A no-nonsense attorney with a reputation for taking on impossible cases, she saw something deeper in our fight. "This isn't just about rules," she told me during one strategy session. "These are coordinated attacks. Someone stands to gain from pushing out property owners like you and Tom." The OOA's tactics were becoming more aggressive. Unexpected inspections, multiple letters each week. They even sent a surveyor to measure the exact height of my grass, claiming it exceeded the approved 2-inch maximum. My photography work suffered. The stress of constant legal battles and HOA harassment was taking its toll. Assignments I'd previously looked forward to now felt like escape routes from the constant battle. Then came the water issue. The HOA sent a letter claiming my ranch's water usage violated community guidelines. Never mind that my well was completely separate from the community water system. Never mind that I'd used this water source for decades. They demanded a complete water usage audit, threatening massive fines if I didn't comply. Tom discovered something interesting during this period. Several properties similar to mine, large, historically significant parcels on the edge of the development, had been facing similar harassment over the past few years. "It's a pattern," he explained, spreading out maps and property records. "Look here. Each of these properties was targeted, then sold at well below market value. And guess who's been buying?" I followed his finger. Real estate development companies, all connected, either directly or indirectly, to members of the Severo Valley Estates OOA board. Karen Richardson's fingerprints were everywhere. My cousin Mike, a forensic accountant, offered to dig deeper. "Something's not right," he told me during a late-night phone call. "The financial trails are too clean, too perfect." The ranch that had been my sanctuary was becoming a battlefield. Every day brought a new letter, a new threat, a new violation. But I was learning something important. These people might have money, might have bureaucratic power, but they had no idea who they were dealing with. My grandfather didn't back down from challenges, and neither would I. It was a Tuesday morning when everything changed. The sound of diesel engines broke the usual desert silence, shattering the peace of my ranch before the sun had fully risen. I stepped out onto the porch, coffee mug in hand, to find a convoy of vehicles blocking my driveway. 2 white SUVs, a massive county surveyor's truck, and most ominously, a gleaming black Mercedes I recognized immediately. Karen Richardson emerged like a general preparing for battle. Tailored pantsuit, those ever-present designer sunglasses, clipboard in hand. Behind her, 2 men in crisp suits that screamed legal team stood with an air of calculated menace. "Mr. Thompson," Karen called out, her voice carrying the false sweetness of a predator, "we're here to perform a comprehensive property assessment." I knew something was different this time. This wasn't a routine inspection. This was something else entirely. The lead surveyor, a tall, thin man with a clipboard and a GPS device, began driving stakes into the ground. Each metal spike felt like a violation, puncturing the earth my grandfather had cherished. "What exactly are you doing?" I demanded, stepping forward. Karen's smile was razor sharp. "We're rezoning a portion of your property. The HOA has determined that your continued non-compliance constitutes effective abandonment of the land. The words hit me like a physical blow. Abandonment? This land had been in my family for generations. Every inch of soil held memories. My grandfather's sweat, my childhood summers, years of careful stewardship. The surveyors were methodical. They measured. They photographed. They marked boundaries that seemed to slice away a significant portion of my ranch, prime land that overlooked the entire valley. "You can't do this," I said, my voice low and dangerous. One of the legal team stepped forward. "We have documentation, accumulated fines, violation notices. The property is being reassessed due to sustained non-compliance with HOA regulations." Tom Rodriguez appeared seemingly out of nowhere, standing beside me. "This is highway robbery," he muttered. The stakes continued to go in. Each one felt like a nail in a coffin, my family's legacy being carved up by bureaucratic vultures. I noticed something else, the way Karen kept looking at a specific portion of the land. The eastern slope with its perfect view of the valley, prime real estate that would be worth millions to a developer. My cousin Mike's words echoed in my head. Something about this felt orchestrated, too perfect, too planned. "We'll be filing a comprehensive report," Karen announced, her voice cutting through the morning air. "The HOA board will review our findings and make a final determination about the property's status." I watched helplessly as they continued their work, measuring, marking, dissecting my heritage piece by piece. Tom pulled me aside. "Something's not right," he whispered. "I've been tracking similar actions across other properties. This isn't just about rules. This is about land, about money." The surveyors finished their work by noon. Karen walked back to her Mercedes, looking like a cat that had just cornered a mouse. The stakes remained, bright markers of my potential destruction. I called Sarah Martinez, my lawyer, immediately. Her response was sharp and immediate. "Don't touch those stakes. Don't say anything else to them. I'm coming out there." As the vehicles drove away, leaving behind those metal markers like wombs in the earth, I realized something fundamental had changed. This was no longer just a fight about HOA rules. This was a war, and I was going to fight back with everything I had. My cousin Mike arrived the day after the surveyors left. Forensic accounting files spread across my kitchen table like a battle plan. A former federal investigator turned private forensic accountant, Mike had a reputation for finding financial skeletons that others missed. "This isn't just about your property," he said, sliding a series of documents toward me. "This is a systematic operation." The evidence was meticulous. Property records showed a pattern stretching back 5 years. Properties like mine, large, historic parcels on the edge of the Saguaro Valley development, had been systematically targeted. Each one faced increasing HOA harassment. Each one eventually sold at well below market value. And the buyers? A web of real estate development companies, all with subtle connections to Karen Richardson and other HOA board members. "Look at this." Mike pointed to a complicated flow chart of property transactions. Karen's cousin, Derek Richardson, owns Saguaro Valley Developments. They've been acquiring these properties for pennies on the dollar. My lawyer, Sarah Martinez, arrived shortly after. A former county prosecutor with a bulldog reputation, she saw the bigger picture immediately. "We're not just fighting a property dispute," Sarah explained, her fingers tracing the connections Mike had uncovered. "This looks like a coordinated land grab, manufactured violations, intentional harassment, potential fraud." The first step was gathering more evidence. Tom Rodriguez became an unexpected ally. His meticulously maintained records of HOA interactions provided crucial documentation. Other homeowners, hearing whispers of our investigation, began reaching out. A retired teacher named Linda from the development's eastern block called with her own horror story. Her small garden had been cited for unauthorized landscaping multiple times. A young couple had been fined for having a child's bicycle left in their driveway for more than 24 hours. The pattern was clear. This wasn't about maintaining community standards. This was about forcing out property owners. Sarah filed a formal complaint with the County Real Estate Commission. Mike began tracing financial transactions. I started documenting everything. Every letter, every interaction, every bizarre violation notice. Local media started to take notice. An investigative reporter from the Savero Valley Herald began asking questions. Karen Richardson's perfectly crafted image began to crack. The first breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Mike discovered a series of emails accidentally copied to an external address, emails that revealed the true extent of the HOA's plans. One particularly damning email from Karen to her cousin Derek read, "These properties are gold mines. Once we clear out the current owners, we can subdivide and develop. Easy millions." The HOA began to panic. The first sign was a series of increasingly desperate communication attempts, certified letters, threats of legal action, attempts to intimidate witnesses. But we were beyond intimidation now. Sarah prepared a comprehensive lawsuit: fraud, conspiracy, intentional infliction of emotional distress. The list of charges was extensive. "They've been running this scheme for years," she explained during a strategy session, "targeting properties with historical value or unique characteristics, creating impossible violation scenarios, driving down property values, then swooping in to buy at a fraction of the cost." Tom Rodriguez provided additional critical evidence. His decades of record-keeping documented similar patterns of harassment against other property owners. The HOA's board members started to crack. One resigned, providing additional internal documentation. Another contacted the state attorney's office, offering to become a witness. Karen Richardson's carefully constructed world was beginning to crumble. "This isn't just about my ranch anymore," I told Mike as we reviewed the growing stack of evidence. "This is about exposing a system that preys on property owners." The fight was just beginning, but for the first time, we had the upper hand. The first public crack in the HOA's armor came during a community meeting that would go down in Saguaro Valley Estates history. What was supposed to be a routine monthly gathering transformed into a public evisceration of Karen Richardson and her corrupt board. Mike had been working behind the scenes, quietly reaching out to other homeowners who had been victimized. The community center was packed, more people than had ever attended an HOA meeting before. Chairs were filled, walls lined with residents who had previously been too afraid to speak up. Sarah Martinez stood at the microphone, a stack of documents in her hand that looked like a weapon of truth. "We have evidence," she began, her voice cutting through the murmur of the crowd, "of systematic fraud, harassment, and intentional manipulation of homeowners." The revelations came like a series of well-placed punches. Financial records showed kickbacks. Email chains exposed coordinated efforts to devalue properties. Property transaction histories revealed a pattern of targeted harassment designed to force out longtime homeowners. One by one, board members began to crack. Mike, who had been working with local investigators, had uncovered a goldmine of documentation. Text messages, internal emails, financial records that painted a damning picture of corruption. The youngest board member, a nervous guy named Eric who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, was the first to break. During a particularly tense moment, he stood up, his hands shaking. "I didn't know," he stammered. "I thought we were just maintaining community standards." His confession was like a dam breaking. Other board members began to look nervous. Karen Richardson, usually so composed, started to lose her carefully maintained facade. Tom Rodriguez, sitting near the front, began presenting his own meticulously collected evidence. Decades of documentation showing how the HOA had systematically targeted specific properties. Each piece of evidence was like another nail in the HOA's coffin. The local media had been tipped off. Reporters filled the back of the room, cameras rolling. This was no longer just a local dispute. It was becoming a full-blown scandal. Sarah Martinez walked the crowd through the evidence with surgical precision. Property valuations, suspicious real estate transactions, a web of connections between HOA board members and local development companies. "This isn't about community standards," Sarah declared. "This is about orchestrated land theft." The most damning evidence came from an unexpected source. A former HOA employee, someone who had worked in their administrative office, came forward with a flash drive full of internal communications. Emails revealed the true extent of the conspiracy, detailed plans to target specific properties, strategies for creating violations, discussions about property values and potential development. Karen Richardson sat frozen, her perfectly coiffed hair suddenly looking less immaculate. The sunglasses she always wore were clutched in her hand, no longer a shield against scrutiny. The State Real Estate Commission representatives took notes. Local law enforcement officials listened intently. What had started as a local dispute was now a potential criminal investigation. "We have proof," Sarah continued, "of intentional harassment, of manufactured violations, of a coordinated effort to force out property owners and acquire their land at below-market prices." One by one, homeowners began to share their stories. The young couple fined for a child's bicycle. The retired teacher harassed about her garden. The elderly residents who had been threatened with fines they couldn't afford. The community center was electric with anger and vindication. As the meeting progressed, it became clear that this was more than just a fight about my ranch. This was about exposing a systemic abuse of power that had been happening for years. Karen Richardson's world was collapsing around her. The carefully constructed facade of community leadership was crumbling, revealing the corrupt machinery underneath. This was just the beginning, and we were just getting started. The courtroom was a crucible of tension. What had started as a local property dispute had transformed into a landmark case that would reshape how HOAs operated in the entire county. State prosecutors had joined our legal team. The evidence we collected was more than just a collection of documents. It was a roadmap of systematic corruption that ran deeper than anyone had imagined. Karen Richardson sat at the defendant's table, a shadow of her former self. Gone were the designer sunglasses, the perfectly pressed blazer. Instead, she wore a simple gray suit that seemed to shrink her, making her look smaller and more vulnerable than I'd ever seen her. Sarah Martinez was a force of nature. Her opening statement was a surgical strike, dismantling the HOA's credibility piece by piece. "This is not about community standards," she told the jury. "This is about a calculated scheme to steal property from hard-working homeowners. A conspiracy that targeted vulnerable residents, manufactured violations, and attempted to strip people of their most valuable asset, their home." The evidence was overwhelming. Financial records showed a complex web of transactions. Emails revealed coordinated efforts to devalue properties. Text messages exposed the cold, calculated nature of their plan. Derek Richardson, Karen's cousin and the owner of Saguaro Valley Developments, was called to testify. Under oath, his carefully constructed narrative began to crumble. "We were just trying to improve the community," he claimed, but his voice lacked conviction. Sarah's cross-examination was brutal. She walked him through a series of property transactions, showing how his development company had systematically acquired properties at fire sale prices, always after the HOA had initiated harassment campaigns. The turning point came from an unexpected witness. Mike had uncovered a whistleblower, a former employee of Saguaro Valley Developments who was willing to testify. Jennifer Martinez, no relation to our lawyer, took the stand. She was nervous, her hands shaking slightly, but her voice was clear and strong. "It was always the plan," she testified. "Target properties on the edges of the development, create impossible violation scenarios, force owners into selling, then develop the land at massive profits." The courtroom was silent. You could hear a pin drop. Surveillance evidence revealed the extent of their operation. Inspectors who were instructed to find violations, board members who received kickbacks, a system so corrupt it seemed almost impossible to believe. Karen's defense team was in shambles. Their arguments became increasingly desperate. They tried to paint us as troublemakers, as people fighting against reasonable community standards. But the evidence told a different story. Tom Rodriguez's decades of documentation proved crucial. He had meticulously recorded every interaction, every violation, every attempt at harassment. His records showed a pattern stretching back nearly 15 years. The state's Real Estate Commission representatives sat in the front row, taking notes. This was no longer just a local case. it had become a referendum on HOA practices across the entire state. As the trial progressed, more and more homeowners came forward. Each story was similar: manufactured violations, impossible demands, systematic harassment designed to force them out of their homes. My own testimony was a turning point. I walked the jury through the history of my ranch, the generations of my family who had worked this land, the calculated attempts to strip me of my heritage. This was never about community standards, I told the jury. This was about power, about greed, about destroying people's lives for profit. When the lunch recess was called, the courtroom buzzed with anticipation. People who had been silent for years were finally being heard. Karen Richardson sat alone at the defendant's table. The woman who had once seemed invincible now looked small, defeated. This was more than a legal battle. This was about justice, about protecting the rights of homeowners, about exposing a system designed to prey on the vulnerable. And we were winning. The verdict came down on a crisp autumn morning. 6 hours of jury deliberation that felt like an eternity. Guilty on all counts. Karen Richardson was convicted of multiple felonies: fraud, conspiracy, intentional misrepresentation, and racketeering. Her cousin Derek faced even more serious charges, with potential prison time stretching into decades. The entire HOA board was dissolved, with most members facing significant legal consequences. The courtroom erupted. Homeowners who had been silenced for years cheered. Tears, hugs, a release of tension that had built up over decades of harassment. But this was about more than just a legal victory. The state legislature began drafting new laws to protect homeowners from HOA overreach. Our case had become a landmark moment, exposing the potential for abuse within these supposedly protective organizations. My ranch, the land my grandfather had worked, the property Karen had tried to steal, stood as a testament to resilience. The historic cattle pens remained. The native wildflowers continued to bloom. Everything Karen had tried to destroy was now protected, not just by law, but by a newfound community solidarity. Tom Rodriguez became a local hero. His meticulously kept records were crucial to breaking the case. The retired civil engineer who had fought the HOA for years was now celebrated as a champion of homeowners' rights. The financial settlement was substantial, not just for me, but for other homeowners who had been targeted. Millions were set aside for those who had been forced out of their properties, those who had suffered under the HOA's corrupt regime. Karen Richardson's fall was complete. Her real estate licenses were permanently revoked, her reputation destroyed. The woman who had once struck fear into an entire community was now a cautionary tale. But the most satisfying moment came 6 months after the trial. The Saguaro Valley Estates was transformed. A new HOA board was elected, comprised of homeowners who understood the meaning of community. Transparent, fair, actually focused on maintaining the neighborhood's quality of life rather than exploiting its residents. Mike, my forensic accountant cousin, discovered something else. The entire land grab scheme was far more extensive than we'd initially thought. What happened in our community was just the tip of the iceberg. Investigations were now spreading to other developments, other HOAs across the state. One afternoon, as I stood on the porch of the ranch, watching the sunset paint the desert in shades of gold and crimson, Tom Rodriguez pulled up in his old pickup truck. "We did it," he said, handing me a bottle of local craft beer. We toasted to justice, to persistence, to the idea that no organization, no matter how powerful, is above the law. The native wildflowers swayed in the breeze. The historic cattle pens stood as they had for generations. My grandfather's legacy was intact. Karen had tried to take everything. Instead, she'd given us something far more valuable: a story of community, resilience, and the triumph of justice. As for the ranch, it would stay in the family, protected, preserved, a reminder that some things are worth fighting for. Epilogue. They say living well is the best revenge. In our case, it was living well while exposing corruption. And oh, what a beautiful exposure it was.